I am here today with one of my dear friends, Dr. Joon Yun. He is the president of Palo Alto Investors. He's a doctor and a thought leader and one of my favorite people. So thank you so much for being here, Joon. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's an honor to be here with my good friend, Maya. I'm excited about this.
Awesome. So I am always uplifted when I speak to you about current and future prospects for the world today. And so I'm wondering, what do you feel most optimistic about today?
You know, I think, and I acknowledge that there are always risks and there are always things going on, difficult circumstances. And the path forward isn't always the most straightforward path. But in the end, I have faith in people. People are almost everybody is good. They're creative. They respond to challenges. They work together. And so if you add all that up, people generally get through almost all the issues. There'll be some lulls. And then when we come out the other side, usually things are much better than the way things had been. And we know that to be the case throughout history. In many ways, I don't think I've been more excited in my lifetime than right now in an environment where I think things feel, I know things feel very uncertain, weird sometimes, and people are concerned. So while acknowledging all that, I think there's also enormous potential in this era. And going back to just counting on the goodness of people and the creativity. And their ability to work together and ability to rise to challenges.
Oh, awesome. So I like that focus of talking about the goodness of people and their ability to work together, because that's essentially why I think both you and I are here and why we're doing the work that we're doing. And so I'm curious to know what you feel is the most important conversation that we need to be having right now. And what's the most important global conversation to be having? If you could have any monopoly on the attention span of consciousness, what would that be?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. There's so many conversations going on right now. The conversation I am most involved in these days is inclusive stakeholding. And inclusive stakeholding is if the idea of inclusion had a baby with the idea of stakeholding, then you'd end up with inclusive stakeholding. So stakeholding has always been very important, having alignment of interests instead of conflict of interest, definitely trying to mitigate perverse incentives, really being aligned with people. And the best way to be aligned with others is to have a vested stake in each other's lives. Historically that was done through genes, and now it's done through stockholding, but friendships, community, belief systems, even common challenges. When you have a common stake, it really tends to engender collaboration naturally. So I think if you have alignment with people, then competition serves the community. So it becomes a race to the top. Whereas if you have misaligned interests within the community or among stakeholders, then competition can produce results that are, less than satisfactory. That's when inequality arises. That's when people get left behind. So I think stakeholding is very important, but historically, we need to do a better job of being very inclusive. And I think this is related to conversations that are going on culturally, but I've always felt that also inclusion by itself is not enough. I mean, after World War I and World War II, we tried to include all the different voices, but unless they have mutual stakeholding, where they actually have a stake in each other's lives, then bringing people to the table can actually lead to divisiveness. So League of Nations broke up almost right away. United Nations has really struggled to be productive together because there's so much balkanized thoughts and so many different agendas instead of enough focusing on the common ground. So at a time when we're having these really important conversations on inclusion, to really find ways to interlock our fates, to create greater interdependence, I think it's a really way to get on the same page so it doesn't feel so polarizing. And we both see the risks and opportunities as common interest and be able to collaborate our way through that.
I like that. You know, it's making me think of the mission we have initiated with SOSV, IndieBio, and Mayfield Fund recently. We formed an alliance to create the Genesis Consortium, which is really to put a spotlight on human and planetary health. So I started with IndieBio investing in biotech companies at a very early stage, and really into technologies that we thought would be ready for a future very far in the future. But it appears that right now that future is here today, and people are ready for the kinds of things that we've been looking at. And so that said, like I'd love to dive deeper into how to, what are the nuts and bolts of that inclusion? Say if we were to bring together, say 5 funds who are perhaps having different priorities, how do you start a conversation that gets people aligned and on the same track of say agreeing on what the biggest challenges there are to solve?
Yes. Number one is having the conversation itself. And in general, I think what the Valley and entrepreneurs around the world are really good at is identifying the challenges. So when I think about inclusive stakeholding, that actually is the process, because you can solve the problem a number of ways. But I'll break it down into the 2 parts, so inclusive stakeholding. So the first thing is to think about who all the stakeholders are of a company. For instance, if you're starting a clean tech company or even the next energy company, really thinking through who are all those that will be affected positively and negatively by the work we do, and really think about how do you make sure that the work doesn't have unintended consequences on others. And you also have to include nature and all those that don't have a voice, like the environment or even future stakeholders, future children that are not alive. So the first process is just that exercise of thinking through all the stakeholders. So like in longevity, we literally think through, future citizens that are unborn. We have to speak up for them because they don't have a voice. We can do it just as a team. We can do it individually, just writing them all down. Who are all the stakeholders, and how are they impacted on a relative basis based on our, the efforts and the unintended consequences. And then the stakeholding part is to assign them co-ownership in the company. So this is the part that is, I think we could really start doing. Is historically, the major innovation in Silicon Valley was including labor in the cap table, using the common stock to give them co-ownership in the company at a time, and this is going back 100 years ago, where that was unheard of. The idea of giving labor, allowing them to be co-owners, was not the way the world was going. In fact, political philosophy had a complete split between capitalism and all of the forms of socialism. And in fact, it got to be counterparties, both the owners of capital and those that work for capital, which is basically labor. So labor had to unionize, collective bargaining. All of these things are symptomatic treatments of the fact that they never really understood that they could be partners together instead of counterparties. So Silicon Valley's major contribution to the world is not transistor, it's not the internet. They introduce the idea of internalizing labor as a stakeholder. So any stakeholder that's not internalized will pay the price of being the excluded stakeholder. So the entire history of the world really is the pain and suffering by the excluded stakeholder, and that could be on class, race, environment. So all the different phenomena have this common root of being the excluded stakeholder. So naming them like Silicon Valley, ingesting them, internalizing the externality, I think was the absolute genius innovation of Silicon Valley. But obviously today's challenges, actually come from the fact that while labor and capital have been aligned, the rest of the world have not been co-owners of that future. So as we move forward, and this is the perfect time to be having this conversation, is we also we have the opportunity to internalize those stakeholders. What if users were stockholders? There were attempts at this about 20 years ago, and there were some regulations against it. But those things are all things that could be innovated on the policy side. I think policy innovation are just as important. Innovations are just as important as economic and technological innovations. So if you can allow them to participate, then number one, when they feel like a co-owner, they'll make contributions to the system. Users can contribute to the well-being of a company. And then if the company does well, the benefits accrue to everybody. So not just the users, then you have to think about the environment, future stakeholders. So again, I think one of the more common forms of exclusive stakeholding is borrowing from the future. So we tend to underestimate how much we are actually taking from future stakeholders, whether it could be plundering of resources or even things like pension funds or student debt. I mean, these things are all just phenomena where when you really think about it, it's just one phenomenon, which is there's an excluded stakeholder that's paying the price that don't have a vote and don't have a voice. So there are additional stakeholders that I think we could start taking in today as we form our companies, and that could be part of the culture of a startup. So when I think about IndieBio, and I think about the innovation potential of the scientists and the creative teams and the management, but I think they're the perfect cohort to be thinking about this kind of stakeholder innovation. And the idea here is not like this is just the right thing to do, which I think it is, but I just think this is good business. Because I think any other form of business, it'll create an externality that will create substantial problems if it's successful, and unintended consequences. And there'll be revolt, and you'll have to go answer to Congress. And I think that's a really difficult way to run a business, where you try to do everything right and people are very unhappy about what you did, and they try to take your company down. I think the best mitigation against that is to just think about all those people up front. You know, the next social media giant will look radically different because I think they can treat the stakeholders much better. So the reason to do this, number one, always is it's the right thing. We're just doing the right thing, just makes sense. But number 1A is because it's just great business. People tend to think that if you're doing the right thing, it must not, you're gonna take a hit. I think it's actually the opposite. I think in the long view now, the way to build sustainability, like the way we think about health, what you want is health, but not health just in the moment of time when you're taking a drug. You want sustainable health. So much of the way we treat patients in the human body today is short-termism. It gets you out of the doctor's office. You've made your symptoms better, but you haven't actually cured anything. So you're 1 year older and sicker. The best way to sustain longevity for the body is to, build it to last. That's the way nature built it for about 40 years. And if we're going to inject innovation into that model, we should treat it the same way. Build it to last so it doesn't need things. We can build companies the same way. The best way to build successful, growing companies is a company that contributes to the world in a way where all the stakeholders feel like they're part of the winning team.
I would love to share this message with our portfolio of companies and founders. I think it's a really important idea to share. Also made me think about your current initiative, which you've been working on for very passionately. It speaks to long-term health, and that is the National Institute for Nutrition. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. And I think just to keep the conversation focused on this topic, it was a stakeholder problem, stakeholder challenge. It was, first you arrive on the scene of nutrition science, and the whole thing feels like a riddle. It says, do this, but don't do that, but don't do that now and do this. And it's right out of Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where almost everything you think is true turns out to be false, and you have to go figure it out again. And meanwhile, everything is saying, eat me, right? Just out of, right out of all of Lewis Carroll's writings, right? He had this insight about how we consume things. And so you have this cacophony, to be more accurate, we had total anarchy of food science. Kind of like what you're seeing in terms of sense making in the real world and social media. We're in the era, we're slipping into information anarchy. But food science did it first. I mean, it was just completely balkanized in terms of what you should do. Everybody had their own view. So what happens is when you have anarchy, when you have no center and you have anarchy, then people get afraid, and then demagogues rise and they take all the power. So food industry has already been through this. So you have so many things that have arisen where power structures that tell you, I know the answer and let me tell you about it, right? And you're seeing this in all realms right now, socially around the world. But in food, definitely, there were these camps that built out that, again, the right answer is that we didn't know, but that's just not a satisfying answer. So people don't say, I don't know. They say, I know, and let me tell you about it. So that became the behavior. And we started eating a certain way. And if you actually look at the result of how we ate, it's just going backwards. Empirically, we were, food became, a negative thing. Food always was the source of life. And in the last 50 years, food became the source of death. It was a thing to be avoided. Diet used to mean what you eat, now it means what you don't eat. I mean, how did we get to this point where we know not only nothing, well, we know some things, but in many ways we know the wrong things that are actually hurting us. So in thinking through this, how do we get to now? I thought about the evolutionary origins of how we got to now, the ontogeny of food science. So it turns out the most important thing about food is not what it is, but it's who gave it to you. So think about the fact that, your mom and dad, they might not know much, but they care about you. So you're basically eating love. Mm-hmm. Whereas now you're fed by people that, instead of being fed by people that love you most, you're fed by people that love themselves most. And the single switch from being somebody's first priority to being somebody's second priority changes everything. Changes everything about every vector of human life, but certainly in food. So now the system can engineer food in a way that maximizes profit, and they use the body kind of as a vessel to monetize, right? So same thing that happened in, you could argue, in modern tech and social media has been happening in the food industry for years. They just basically figure out the algorithm. It could be sugar, salt, fat, and just use it to just continue to take value out of the human body. And that all happened because of a single mutation. It's a social mutation, which is that we used to live with people that loved us most and we were fed by them. And now we're not fed by them, we're fed by counterparties. So when I looked at okay, who's actually in charge of nutrition research? It's not your mom, it's not your dad, it's not even the federal government per se. It's basically industry, commercial interest. So almost all the studies are funded directly or indirectly by the companies. And, their mission statement is they got to take care of shareholders. So it's, so the fact that 93% of sponsored studies conclude in favor of the sponsor, that's not evil. That's just normal, right? I mean, that's just human bias. And the fact that people are unhappy about that, I think it's more the fact that we don't have public funding for nutrition science. Public policy and government organizations are there to protect public interest. No federal agency had as its core mission nutrition science. It was everybody's, for the lack of a better framing, it was everybody's stepchild. Everybody cared about it a little bit, but no one was responsible. So how do you create a new federal agency? The proposal was we need a National Institute of Nutrition in the same way that, at one point we didn't have a National Institute of Health, which is now, is the, it's the body that provides scientists funding to do their research in the name of public benefit, right? NIH is was an amazing idea. It actually took 60 years to develop the NIH because policy just takes time. Same thing with the FDA, which doesn't actually fund food science. FDA basically regulates packaging and on the drug side, approval, the marketing potential for a drug. But that took 25 years. And it arose at a time when there was so much snake oil that finally government said, all this is, we don't know what's real science. It seems like almost all of it is contestable and a lot of fake science. So we just need to have an independent body under the Department of Health, which is now HSS, that protects public interest. So, food is, is I think one of the great policy lag errors. When President Lincoln created the Department of Ag, he didn't foresee an era where you wouldn't be fed by your family because we were agrarian back then. 150 years ago, we farmed our own food. And, fast forward 150 years from now, only 2% of us are farmers, and the rest of us eat food that is provided for us by industry. So now that these are two separate parties, I think it makes sense to uncouple the responsibilities. So to have the Department of Ag continue to take care of the interests of the agriculture industry, but then have nutrition be under Department of Health and Human Services. So each can have just a single mission statement. National Institute of Nutrition can provide public funding for nutrition science in the name of public health, and the Department of Ag can do the exact same thing, but really focus on production science and the interests of the agriculture industry. So that was a proposal.
And you brought together several stakeholders for this proposal.
I think the right way to frame it, I think, is that stakeholders got together. And it started with conversation like this. I mean, it was it essentially just had the exact 3-minute conversation, 5-minute conversation about how we got to now, and talked to folks that have been stewards in the industry for many years, often retired. They've served as the head of these agencies. Dan Glickman, who was the secretary of Department of Agriculture, David Kessler, who was the commissioner of the FDA. And Dari Mosafarian, who's the current dean of the Tufts School of Nutrition, which, interestingly, there's only one endowed graduate school of nutrition in the country. That alone is information. I mean, how could it be that, we have a healthcare system where $900 billion out of the $1 trillion budget per year is spent on diet-related diseases, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. Nutrition that's endowed. He's the dean. It wasn't like there was this broad community of people that are serving the academic needs of our nation. Mm-hmm. So that was the initial cohort. We authored some pieces together, and then it just kind of grew from there. There's this sort of organic feel. They brought on other leaders, Yvonne Maddox, who was the former acting deputy director of the NIH, number 2 under Francis Collins. She's an absolute dynamo, great thinker, really thinking about all the different stakeholder issues. She's a medical doctor, scientist, very experienced in the policy side. She joined our team. The Rockefeller Foundation were very generous supporting all the policy development work. They became a partner. Joseph Lacunza, who's the chairman of Brigham and Women's Department of Medicine at Harvard. Senator Tom Harkins, who was in the Senate committee, the Health Committee, so really served in a congressional capacity, policy capacity for many years, thinking through all these issues. Kathy Wojtecki, she was at the USDA, helped co-author the nutritional guidelines. I mean, so all the folks that were actually doing the work in this area self-assembled as a team. We're not an organization. We're not a company. We don't have any contracts. Nobody gets paid. There are no titles. We just like working together. to see if this is something that Congress would be willing to take on as an initiative for public benefit.
I love that. And, it's a great example of what is possible in the ways that we can work together when it's a less transactional environment where people are truly doing it from their hearts to create something for the future. So speaking of the future, what do you hope to see come out of this? I know you said it was somewhat of a 30-year long journey, if I recall, maybe sooner than that.
Yeah, I don't know. I gotta say, when you look back at the history of the NIH and FDA, I don't think the folks that helped steward those agencies into origination could have ever imagined what actually happened. So when we started the NIH, it was basically came out of the military hospital, and it was to diagnose infectious diseases and treat infectious diseases in the military. That's what the NIH was. I mean, and then within a couple of decades, it had started funding medical students and residents. Like, that was not in the original vision. And then eventually it started to fund other types of sciences, medical sciences, not just in infectious diseases and diagnostics. And if you think about the one NIH does now, it's at the current work that it does could never have been imagined when it was founded. So the way to look at this is you just set the table and just let humans flourish. I mean, just set up the thing itself, and just like, it's like watching the sunset. After that, you're a cheerleader, and just watch people try out ideas, build things, do really creative things. Same thing with the FDA. Again, it was initially just created to regulate interstate commerce of foods to make sure it wasn't contaminated, and it was what people said it was, right? To now, they're approving gene therapy. I mean, these are things that were unimaginable 100 years ago when they started. So what can the NIN do, National Institution, do in the 21st century? I have no idea. Just set the table and watch people do great things.
So that brings me to thank you for being a part of this really grand initiative, and in sharing how important inclusive stakeholding is. I have always admired your mindset, and that is one of, as I said earlier, optimism. But you're also very good at being the source of good news, being the source of solutions. How would you recommend that any individual, and I know we spoke about this earlier, but I'd love to go over it again, but how do you suggest we tune into that more to help each other focus on the solutions, focus on what we can create, focus versus the bad news, going down a negative spiral? What is the first and foremost thing we can do for each other?
Yeah, I don't know. I want to finish one more thought on the stakeholding, which is, we just published a week and a half ago the definitive guidance document that was peer reviewed, and it was co-signed by our entire team. But then we also have signatories for the paper that endorse the paper. And we now have 75 different companies and organizations. We got big food companies, startups, associations, nutritionists. So the inclusive stakeholding model includes the industry itself, the food industry. They're not, again, kind of like, oil companies. I mean, there are always unintended consequences, but people still want to move forward. They all want to be part of the solution. And part of the reason I think this is going faster than we imagined was because we solicited all of their inputs, and we're asking them to all be part of the solution. And they're signing this as co-signatories is the thing that is the accelerant of the entire movement. The inclusive stakeholding includes exclusive stakeholding maybe caused the problem. Now inclusive stakeholding is a solution. So whatever the mutation was, we're going right for that from a therapeutic perspective. As it relates to how do we maintain optimism? I mean, number one, I think being around optimistic people like you is very helpful. That's a easy answer. And always, there are probably other people that are optimistic I would try to get their answers to. So I'm gonna just put those things out there. And then I also want to acknowledge that there's always suffering and bad things going on. I think it's important not to be blind to those things, that in fact, we are very cognizant of the excluded stakeholder and the issues around the world. Having said all that, I think being solution-oriented and action-oriented, and knowing that in a sea of pessimism, people always stepped up over and over again to imagine, and many people stepped up to provide solutions for those challenges. So we have a long history of being successful. So I think having that faith that people will, the solutionists will prevail. Mm-hmm. They will prevail. And because they will prevail, then you go look for them as investments. So all of a sudden you start looking for the people that think that they can make things better. And you listen to their stories and you can't help but be hopeful because, I mean, they may be deluded or they may be right, but when you're listening to people that have these incredible ideas, you can't help but be more optimistic. By the way, almost every venture capitalist I know is an optimist, right? They would not have survived in this industry if they said no to every great idea. They actually say yes to enough good ones, and that's why they've been able to provide an incredible service to the world to kind of match the aspirations and the dreams of entrepreneurs with financing and team building to make things happen. I do want to just break it down a little bit in the process. So, being action-oriented means living as a verb rather than a noun. I think as we get older, we tend to think more like nouns. So we'll, when you're young, you talk about love, but when you're older, you talk about passions. And passion is something you have, and it's very much about self. And at the end of your life, obviously, you're not the sum of what you have. It's not just some of your passions, some of your gifts. It's what you bestowed on others. What gifts what did you give? What did you contribute? Mm-hmm. What did you love? So when you think like a verb means you're bestowing. So just like you wouldn't say to your child at night, I have a passion for you. You would just say, I love you. So somehow we've gotten away from just being a verb, as just be a verb, right? Instead of being a noun. That's going to make you look outwards, and it's going to focus you on contributions instead of what can I get out of it. It's like, okay, what can I contribute? And when you have a team of people that think that way, the whole thing works. They're acting, they're bestowing, they're focused on others, the world's needs rather than nouns. What do I have? What's my piece? Those are not the kind of conversations that are productive. So really create this virtual cycle of being a verb rather than being a noun. And if like an easier way to even think about that is just be like a child. Like children don't think about nouns, they just do, right? They don't sit around and have meetings. They don't sit around and overthink things. They're just like moving. They're just, they're doing, being biased towards action. So we know that we were all kids once, and we know how to live that way. So this isn't something you have to build as a skill. You always had it. You just have to tap into it. Think like a kid. And so it was always in you. It's a recovery function, kind of like, youth and health, right? It's not like we have to invent the fountain of youth. We had it. I mean, it's not in some mountain it's not in some pill. It was inside our body. So the gateway to healthy longevity is probably going to be something inside. So same thing with building this kind of resilient companies and resilient society. It's just tapping into what we already know and what we know we're capable of, and oftentimes something we had once.
So that brings me to, well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Joon. You're just brilliant and inspired me always, as I think about the future, and what I would like to do is bring together the people who are giving, the people who are doing, and make that a powerful force in the universe, in the world. Because I think it's very important to shine the light on the possibilities and the people who are doing and giving right now, because everybody has that ability, and much of it is untapped right now, perhaps because of the lack of optimism in the future, or the fear. And we all have something to give, and we are all needed. So thank you for that reminder. And is there anything else you like to say before we say goodbye to each other?
No, you mentioned in the lead up to the call about leadership. Maybe this will be just a parting thought. Leadership is, I think, one of the most, it's something that is considered very important, but it's also very vague, very contested. And then everybody has a different way of, not everybody, there's many different ways to think about leadership. I only think of one, and I acknowledge other forms of leadership. And if you define leadership as a creation of followers, then to me, the system dies, because the leaders are extracting from the followers, and there's no future. It's like, whereas if one defines leadership as a creation of leaders instead of creation of followers, then it just propagates. So if you think about how evolution works, you basically bear children, you nurture them to be the next leader, who then creates the next leader. So that type of leadership self-propagates, and it's worked very well as a formula for evolution. It's only the sort of modern human who has decided that she or he, as a leader, is going to create followers. And so to me, this is like a blind alley. We're out on a random limb in the tree of life. It's not going anywhere. So kind of just sticking to the definition of leadership as the creation and the nurturing of the leadership of others, I think that's the only thing to remember. And to me, that actually, the right word is stewardship. I wouldn't even use the word leadership. But if we're forced to use the word leadership, that's how I would define it, and really narrow it to that definition. I think that is a self-propagating model of success for one's own life, the lineage of a company, of a society. So that would be my parting thought in terms of how people can treat each other, getting back to your original question at the beginning.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Yeah, for sure. You have helped many people unleash their potential around you. So I see you as an emergent steward for the planet. So
thank you, Maya. Thanks for having me.